be a more interactive session or he'd want questions at the end. Um, and then secondly, I'm going to be sending a feedback survey. I will be posting it on the chat. If I can request for you to please fill this out. And the reason being is that we would want to gain insights on whether this workshop was helpful. And it would also help us here at the RCD unit to plan for future workshops. And it will ensure that you receive a certificate of attendance. So I'm going to be posting that shortly. So I also wanted to introduce the RCD-MS system. I'm not too sure if y'all are familiar with it. So you would need to log on to Ulink, navigate and click on the Services tab, and then navigate and click on the RCD-MS tab, and then you can register. You need to register using your UJ email address, not Gmail, not Rocket Mail or anything like that. It will only recognize your UJ email address. So the reason for this system is basically to streamline your research journey. It will give you an opportunity to look at our workshops, book writing consultations, and stay updated on all events that are happening in this year. However, if you're having a challenge with registering on the RCD-MS system, we have two offerings for you. Firstly, we have a digital onboarding session, and that will be taking place from the 9th of April to the 23rd of April, every day from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. And I will also be posting that Teams link in the chat. So you will log on, and if you are experiencing any challenges, I can help, I can assist you in registering. Furthermore, my colleague Lawrence will be physically at um, different venues. He will be at DFC on the 9th, APK on the 10th, and APB on the 11th to assist you with registering. Kindly note you would need your proof of registration, the soft copy, because it requires you to upload it in order to complete your registration on the RCD-MS. Moving on to our presenter of the day, Prof. Krishna Govender is a senior lecturer in the Department of Chemical Sciences at the University of Johannesburg. Apart from lecturing organic, inorganic, and physical chemistry at the undergraduate and honors levels, his research focuses on computational chemistry and material sciences in the field of drug design. His research group focuses on quantum mechanics, molecular dynamics, and hybrid QMMM. His ongoing collaborations with the University of KZN, University of Technology, University of Fort Hare, University of Cape Town, Cape Peninsula University of Technology, Stellenbosch University, and University of Sri J1. Okay, that university is in India. Um, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our presenter, Prof. Govender.
Okay, so I trust you can see my slide.
Yes, I can see your slides.
Okay, let me. All right, great. It's moving. Okay, so I'm going to try and jump between screens during the course of the presentation, right? So I'm not one that likes to just talk to myself. So if there's questions and I see something pop up in the chat, or if there's a hand raised in between, then no problem. You can just, we can then try and make this a bit more interactive instead of me sitting here and talking to you guys the whole time. Right, so basically, this is the very new thing to me, right? So I'm used to presenting on science and not so much on how you actually establish the research that you're trying to pursue. But I decided to give it a shot and use my own experience to give you an outline of what I feel finding and defining your research in natural sciences actually means. All right, so basically we start with what exactly is research, right? All of you guys that are probably here are either researchers or maybe undergraduate students or whatever in the science field, or you could be in any other field, but particularly we're going to focus mainly on the sciences, right? So research is essentially just a systematic way of getting your data, interpreting the data, and then expanding on the knowledge that you have in a specific field of study. Right, so it's a process to investigate that you use of investigation that goes beyond just mere observing things and gathering of information, right? We usually try to develop something that gives you new knowledge or something that you can make a difference somewhere in the world with, right? It involves formulating research questions or hypotheses, designing methodologies, collecting and analyzing data, and then drawing meaningful conclusions. And the primary objective of research is to contribute to the existing body of knowledge by uncovering new insights, validating existing theories, or challenging the prevailing assumptions. Look, because you notice in the sciences, you often have people that publish papers, and then you get somebody coming along later on publishing another paper saying that that person's paper was wrong, right? So that's one way that one person can do research. Alternatively, you can come with a completely new perspective as to how to do the research, and that is also then considered scientific research, right? So it's driven by the pursuit of truth, accuracy, and evidence-based understanding. So this for me is the most key thing that look, at the end of the day, your findings need to be accurate and reproducibility is quite key. Nowadays, this is what it's all about. If you do research and you want to present your research in a publication or at a conference, if somebody else goes and tries to do the same thing, they need to be able to reproduce the results that you're getting. Especially in this data-driven world we're in now, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but your protocols need to be in place that you can actually have people reproduce whatever you do. Right, so research can also take various forms, right, depending on the discipline and the nature of your inquiry. It can be empirical, where you're basically just collecting and analyzing data through experiments, surveys, observations, or interviews. It can also be theoretical, involving the critical analysis of existing literature and concepts to develop new frameworks or models. And the research process is characterized by systematic and organized steps, right? So you often have to have a process that you're going to use in order to tackle this research problem that you come across. And it begins with identifying a research problem or a topic of interest, followed by extensive literature review. You will find that this will come up quite often in my talk, that knowing what's out there and knowing what people have done is crucial in order for you to actually be doing research that will be meaningful. Because it's pointless doing something that someone's already done, then there's no innovation and novelty coming from your work. So to make it practically impossible to get published, or even if you do present at a conference, somebody else might say, oh no, but I've done this already. So you see, you have to be very careful of that whole concept that you need to make sure that what you do, there must be some novelty to it, right? And research questions or hypotheses are formulated and the research design is developed to guide data and collection and analysis. So everything we do nowadays, it always involves collecting data. It's just the manner in which you actually process this data that could differ from person to person. And that processing could then also lead to something new in the case of sciences, right? And I think in other disciplines as well. But because you're working in a data-driven world, not every single person will process the data in exactly the same manner. And you might get different answers out from processing the data in different ways. Right, so our focus is on natural sciences, right? So you could be exploring research in, I'm only going to choose a few here, but there's many scientific fields. But the primary ones we're going to just say is, okay, let's say physics, biology, chemistry, earth science, or environmental studies, right? So, the physics, you've got the bio, you've got your chemistry, earth science, and then the environmental studies. So what is a typical timeline when it comes to natural sciences? So if you look, all of you, if you are already at the higher postgrad levels, would have gone through the same process. It's exactly the same process that I had to go through. You start off at the honors level. That's where you first start doing research, right? Because you'll have a small research project that's usually part of your honors course, and you also then do coursework. And from there, you get to the master's level, where now your research abilities are tested a bit more because you now start doing your own research. And if you are doing a dissertation, it would typically mean that you're doing only research, or you could be doing a master's through coursework, where then you're going to have lectures and you're going to have to be doing the research project on the side as well. But again, that you're developing your flow of how to do research. Often, master's studies don't involve doing new work. In my research group, that's not how I work. I believe that from the master's level already, you need to be doing something that's slightly novel so that you learn how to do research. In most masters, I know that a lot of colleagues of mine also, they basically just let the student do something that's already been done just to show that they have the ability to do research. And from masters, obviously, we get to the PhD level. And you'll notice my blocks are getting larger and larger, right? Because the amount of research that you have to undertake in each level is going to get more and more. So at the PhD level, this is where now you have to come up with your own research projects and basically try to find a way that you're going to do your research and how you're going to undertake this research. Sometimes you'll get supervisors that will give you projects. In most cases, I mean, your supervisor directs which route you need to go with when it comes to a research project because they have specific interests, right? And from the PhD, there's the postdoctoral research fellows. Now, again, here, their purpose is nothing but research. And as you go up in these levels, the thing is, this concept of publish or perish gets more and more intense, right? So when you do these in the science field, it's often required of you to, not so much at the master's level, but at the PhD level, before you submit, you need to have a paper or two published prior to actually being allowed to do your final submission. And as a postdoctoral, you basically have to just be there to publish, right? You're getting a salary, and your point is to publish papers that are then relevant in the field that you're working in. So from a postdoc, if you decide to go the academic route, then of course you get into academics. Now, one thing I didn't put down here is that in the academic space, there is a bunch of different things that one can go into, right? Your academic space, you can start off as an assistant lecturer. You can then move on to the lecturer level. From the lecturer level, you get to senior lecturer level. Then you get to associate professor, and then you get to full professor. So in all of those steps, it's not only research that you actually partake, because when you become an academic, teaching is also a crucial part of the work you do. So yes, research is key, but it's not the only thing you're doing. So you have to balance it out that you actually can do the teaching that you're required to do, plus the research that you want to pursue. And then that research also, you have to do reading and make sure that this is novel research, because in order to get to that professorship, you basically eventually need to become an expert in that particular study that you're doing, or whichever field that you're studying towards. Right? So to climb that ladder, you have to show the ability to actually be doing research, right? So we're going to just touch on a few things that I think is relevant to when it comes to doing research. So what we're going to look at is, okay, you have to first start off like, all right, one key thing before we actually get into this is that a lot of students, I know that at some point I also did it myself, that when you've completed your PhD, that fine, maybe you'll do your postdoctoral fellowship with your supervisor that you did your PhD with, which for me, I would say, yes, it's okay to do that for like a year, but afterwards you need to actually expand your horizon. So always pursue a postdoc outside the research that you're doing with your supervisor. So try to do your postdoctoral research at a different institute or with somebody else, because that will like help to expand your knowledge, and you're not just confined to the space of what your supervisor is doing. And essentially, remember, that's an expert in the field, right? Especially if your supervisor is a full professor. So if you're going to go now try dive into the same type of research, there's a good likelihood that that individual is probably going to beat you to the punch, right? Unless you have a very novel way of coming about doing what they do. So it's often a good idea to try and pursue postdoc somewhere else so that you get ideas from other places on how to do this stuff. No one's saying you don't need to do the same research. You can still 100% do it, but you just have to find better ways to do it, right? So that you can actually now get things before the person that started the whole thing actually does. Right, so just something to keep in mind. So we're going to basically look at, fine, exploring your broader areas of interest. We're going to narrow down the topic. framing a specific research question, establishing the research context, formulating hypotheses and testing them, and then there's certain common pitfalls that you would like to avoid when it comes to doing research, right? So first, we will start with exploring broader areas of interest. So the first step when it comes to trying to define your own research is to look at the broader landscape of natural science. Now, obviously, it is very broad. There are many topics that one could pick, but where does it all start? The primary thing is to read, right? You have to read the recent literature. And nowadays, you've got all of these AI tools and various other things that can actually assist you all in finding the topic of interest and only giving you the information that's relevant to you. So my suggestion there is to actually learn how to use some of these tools. And I know the RCD guys are actually will be having something related to what different AI tools are available for you to make use of. So that's something you should definitely attend. And there you can then learn how to find your literature without going through the step of, the old ways of doing this was we didn't have all these tools that you guys have access to now. You had to go to a library and go pick up a book and read. So now everything's available online, and UJ subscribes to many, many journals that you can actually then get access to the papers and then go through things to see what are the recent discoveries, what are the trends, and what are the gaps in knowledge. I personally used to always use Nature as a benchmark because people that publish in Nature, obviously it's very high impact journal, but that's new and novel work, right? So there's always one or two holes somewhere that one can discover that you can try and find ways to resolve so that you then also find research that's novel. Right? And then you attend lectures, conferences, and seminars. So this will provide you with insight into what researchers in that field are currently doing. Right? And the main thing is when you go to these conferences, it's not about going there and sitting and just listening to a bunch of old people speak. And then find maybe some of your colleagues also, you're there to support them and you're just there to listen to everybody talk and then that's it. No, you need to network. So you must network with people that are outside your research group. So it's a common thing with a lot of students that when you go to conferences, you will always blend with your research group. You're not going to get any additional knowledge from that. You already know all your research group members. You'll already know what work each of you is doing. So why not go outside those bounds and speak to other people that are present? And that way you find out about their work. And then perhaps maybe there could be some sort of collaboration that one can establish. Because collaboration is key. This is one of the main things. When it comes to research nowadays, you must be willing to collaborate, right? And the only way to do this is if you actually now put yourself out there and try and find out what are other people doing. Right. So the other option is to also consult with a mentor or advisor, who would be a professor or senior academic staff member, who can help you explore the big questions in your field and point you to promising areas of research. So of course, you worked with your supervisor over the years. So if you decide you're going to go down the academic route and you want to do research, then you'll find out from your senior academic, okay, what type of research do they do? And then you try and see, okay, what gaps are there in this research that he's doing, he or she? And how then can I fill these gaps? And in that way, you establish then your own sort of research domain or like specification that you're looking for. Right? And then again, always make sure that it's novel. If you come up with an idea, you must first go and check that has somebody already tried this. If it's already been tried, has there been papers published on this? So that way you will then know whether you're in the right sort of ballpark or not, or you need to start thinking maybe a bit more out the box. Right, and then your curiosity and passion play an important role. Remember, I have no special talent. I am only passionately curious. So this is Einstein's word, right? So of course, you as a scientist, one thing that should drive you is the science, right? We want to discover new things. So what problems or mysteries in the natural world fascinate you? And if you can look at, even if it's like genetic evolution, for example, right? Or understanding climate change, there must be a personal interest that drives you to do what you want to do. In my case, it was computational chemistry because I discovered, okay, I can combine computers and chemistry, and these were two things I enjoyed. So It's all about what you enjoy and try and see, okay, so how can I actually take what I enjoy and turn it into a research sort of component of mine. Right now, you've got the broad topic. Now, of course, during world hunger or solving climate change overnight is not a possibility, right? So the broader question is what we want to answer ultimately when you get to that very high professional level, when you become the senior academic, it's now the expert in your field. But when you're starting out, you obviously can't jump that high. You're going to have to start off lower down to work your way up there. So you know what your ultimate goal is. That is great. But narrow down the topic so that you can actually, create sort of building blocks to get to your ultimate goal. So how would you do that? You would basically identify the broad topic first. Then the next is narrowing it down, right? So you see the broader topic is all the possible things you want to solve. Right? Then from all the possible things, you can maybe pick one or two. From those one or two, you narrow it down to just initial exploration of those one or two topics. And finally, you need to come down to what's known as the narrowed it down by research questions. What questions do you want to answer for this particular topic that you're looking at? Right? And if you're going to constantly focus on the broad, you're going to end up with a whole lot of information. It's going to just be information overload and you're going to not know where you're going. So it's always best to bring it back down to earth, right? So hence the picture. Just narrow everything down so that you come down to a point where you just have research questions that you wish to answer and then ways that you would like to answer these questions. Right, so focus on a specific question. So if you start by breaking down the large area of interest into specific questions, let's say we look at if you're interested in climate change, as I said, you may narrow this down to how does urbanization perhaps impact local climate patterns. Right, so that's a slightly now smaller topic versus just climate change as a whole in the world. That's kind of a bit too much, right? So maybe the goal is to get there, but you're going to build it up slowly. And identify manageable scope. So consider the feasibility of your research based on available resources, time, and data. Make sure the question is specific enough to address within the scope of a research project. Because remember, these projects that you're going to formulate, these are projects that typically are going to be done over a period of, say, a year, if it is an honor study. And there, if a student is doing the work, that honor student also has coursework that they need to go do, right? So you cannot make a very broad project for that student because then they're not going to have the time to finish it. So you have to make a very small project, one that can show the student, okay, doing research in this field is going to be of interest to them. And then that might help them pursue a master's after they're done with their honors. Right? And then if you're doing it for a honors master student, again, there you need to remember that student needs to complete within 2 years. And then a PhD student, they have 3 years. Right? So your projects need to be adjusted in a way that it will fit within those different time frames. Because I guarantee you, when you become a researcher and an academic, trying to do the research on your own, you're just not going to have the time because you're going to be lecturing and you're going to have to do the research. So this is why you have to get research students and you then build your research groups up via that route so that the students can then work on the research side, and then you obviously also have your teaching you're dealing with, but you assist the students every now and then with certain aspects in order to try and make sure that that research goal is achieved. Right, and then use keywords. So when you're narrowing down these literature reviews, you're obviously going to be looking for specific keywords. When you first start, maybe you'll start very broad, but then you start seeing there's common words that people use. So then you use these keywords to narrow down your literature review. And this can guide your research to focus toward a more specific aspect of this large topic that you're trying to tackle. And then you have to frame a specific research question. So basically, the first thing you need to do is address a gap in the existing knowledge. So you've reviewed all the literature, you've identified areas where the knowledge is lacking. So this might be in the form of conflicting theories, unexplored variables, or areas that have not been extensively studied, right? So find out what is it, what's the gap, and what is it that you're going to bring to this gap to fill it, basically. It must be measurable and testable, right? And as I said, reproducibility also is quite key nowadays. So ensure your research questions allow you to gather data and test your hypotheses. So if you're interested in the effect of temperature on enzyme activity, then make sure you can manipulate temperature and measure enzyme activity in a controlled setting. So obviously you need to have the instrumentation that can do these things. Now, if you're a researcher that's just starting out, you probably may have a lab that you've gotten for yourself, but the instrumentation to do the studies is possibly not there. So of course, you have to raise funds and make sure you get the funds that will then get you the instrumentation that can achieve the goal that you want. And to get those funds, yes, you'll have to put together some research proposals and then submit that for funding. And should you get the funds, then you can do that. But have a fail safe. If you don't get that, what is your alternative? Is there cheaper alternatives that you could probably use to try and get to maybe not the ultimate goal, but to try and get close? And then perhaps with the papers you publish showing that you're now becoming, more a researcher, you can then apply for funds that will fill in that gap later on for you and help you then get the instrumentation you may need. And of course, as I say, collaboration is key. If you have people that you're collaborating with, maybe you don't have the instrumentation, but somebody else does. So through collaboration, you can then have them sort of run the experiments that you require, and you can do other things for them that then help the collaboration to continue. Right? Be clear and concise. So avoid overly complex questions or those that are too vague. Because if you're on either end, it's a problem. Because if a question is too complex for you to solve, how exactly are you getting to the solution for it? If it's too vague, then the same sort of thing that, okay, fine, you answer this question, then you're done. What's next? So have a focused question that leads to more coherent data collection and analysis. And so as an example, if I give you the broad question, how does climate change affect ecosystems? So that's quite broad. But if I say, okay, a more specific question that's related to the top is how does a 2-degree increase in temperature affect the migration patterns of Arctic birds? So you're still getting to the ecosystems eventually, but I mean, you've narrowed it down a bit, right? So this helps you then. As I say, you always build your questions up to get to that final goal, but start off small. And once you have a clear research question, the next is to position it within the broader scientific context, right? So now you're establishing the research context. So literature review, as I told you, you're going to see it coming over and over. You must make sure you understand what's currently in the literature and how your work is going to fit into what's already out there, or how's it going to deviate? Because remember, sometimes discovering things may not necessarily just be through a specific scientific question you're trying to answer. Sometimes it happens by accident. So if that happens, great, it happens. But always at least know the route you're going to take to get there. And try not to duplicate other people's research, because then you're going to end up with situations where if you have conflicting research, if the other individual submits a publication prior to you, and you're doing almost the same thing when you have to submit a publication, it's a good likelihood that if that person gets in first, their research gets published before yours, and then yours is considered obsolete. So you don't want to have that happen either. Right? So clearly also define the relevance of your research. Why is it important? How does it contribute to the scientific community? And does it solve a practical problem, or does it advance fundamental knowledge? And nowadays, remember, everything comes down to the SDGs, right? So your research needs to fit within one of those SDGs. And basically, all funders will look for it. And if there's societal impact or all of these things. So these are all things you need to take into consideration. So when you're formulating a research, it's not just for you. It is also to show that how will it benefit, say, the community or wherever else, so that when you are writing a proposal for this research to be funded, you're able to then show the funders that, okay, this thing can have an impact because of so and so. Right, and then the theoretical framework. So you identify a background or model that supports your research. So if you're studying the effects of pollutants on aquatic ecosystems, understanding the ecological theories and environmental models will guide your research design. Right. So, of course, it's not a bad thing to focus on research that's say outside of your domain, because one of the things now that's also a big driver is that you have to have interdisciplinary research, right? We can no longer just say do chemistry for chemists. You need to have a component where you say, okay, you're doing this chemistry, but it can be beneficial to engineers, or you're collaborating with engineers and biologists. And so there has to be a unity between the different disciplines. So your research must tie into these different aspects so that when you do establish collaborations, you try to avoid established collaborations with people that are already, say, in the same discipline as you. You try and do cross-disciplinary research. That is now one of the key things that a lot of people are looking for. Right, and then judging your approach or justifying your approach. So why did you choose this specific area and approach? And can your findings be generalized? Or are they specific to certain?
Rob? Prof. Govender?
Yep.
Sorry,
Yeah.
we lost you there for a second.
Oh, okay. Where was I?
You were right at the bottom, justifying your approach.
Okay, so fine. Let me go over that again. So you justify your approach of research by first choosing a specific area and approach, right? And then it's like when you do experiment, can your findings be generalized? So is there a general approach to actually doing the work, or are they specific to certain conditions? So must you have these conditions in order for this thing to work? That's for if how you justify what you're planning to do. Okay. Now you have to formulate hypotheses and test them. So a hypothesis is nothing more than a statement that predicts the relationship between variables, and it serves as a foundation of any scientific investigation, right? You have, especially in statistics, they use hypothesis and hypothesis testing a whole lot, but in other disciplines as well. So how do you formulate an hypothesis? So you base it on the research question you've chosen. They should be testable and falsifiable. So basically, it's testing, falsification, and reproducibility, right? So if the research question is about the impact of urbanization on local climate, then your hypothesis might be, okay, urban areas will experience a higher average temperature than rural areas due to heat island effect, or, the heating effect, basically, right? So that is just an example. But this is then the hypothesis is usually coming from the bigger question. So you hypothesize something, and then you have to prove whether you can prove that hypothesis true or false, basically. Right, then you design your experiments and studies. So once your hypothesis is formulated, you need to design the experiments, surveys, or field studies to test the hypothesis and ensure that your study design controls for other variables and is robust enough to provide reliable results. Because remember, you might cater for, say, the temperature on a day, but then if the weather decides to change and it starts to rain, how do you compensate? So these are just things that you need to keep in mind, especially if you, for example, in the sciences where you're going to do field work. And then data analysis and interpretation. This is a crucial one. So the final step is testing this stuff. So taking your data, analyzing it, and interpreting the results. So you need to make sure that you use appropriate statistical methods if it's required, and you draw conclusions that directly address your research question. Because remember, you're not just collecting this data for nothing. The purpose of getting this data and analyzing it is to get to the goal, which is to answer the question, which is the research question you formulated right at the beginning. Right, and then finally, we got common pitfalls to avoid, right? So don't choose a topic that's too broad or too narrow. Because as I say, when you work with too broad a topic, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually get to the final result, which is solving the research question. If it's too narrow, you answer the question and then you stop. What's next? So try as much as possible to keep it relatively simple, but something that you can build up on. So try not to make it too broad, because the broadness is going to make it too complex for you to try and solve the problem. So you often want to be that part in between, the narrow and the broad. So just so that you can always expand on. Right? And then neglecting the importance of solid literature review. Yes. So failing to do a proper review of literature will most likely lead to you replicating the work that's been done by others. And what happens there, then you basically haven't addressed any gaps. And then when you do try to publish, your work is going to constantly now get rejected because you're not addressing any new questions. So, and look, be honest with you, being in research for a while now, you should also get used to rejection because papers will never always get accepted on the first round. There's often things that reviewers will come back with, they'll have issues with certain things. Sometimes they will reject your paper outright. It shouldn't now be the naysayer of everything. It doesn't mean that your research is bad. It just means that fine, maybe you need to address certain things. Some reviewers are quite nice and they'll tell you what sort of things you can address to fill the gaps. But others will just reject you and not tell you anything. So you have to then now go figure it out yourself. So don't worry about you will always get bad reviews and it just happens. It's one of those things. Just like you'll never always get the funding. So it's something you learn to accept over time. But you keep trying, right? So motivation is key. And then overcomplicating the hypothesis. So again, your hypothesis, what you plan to test, needs to be simple enough for you to test and check that, okay, the different things you want to address can be addressed. And if you overcomplicate that, then you're going to end up with basically you're going to overload yourself and you're going to have too many variables to look at. And then you end up not answering anything at all. And ignoring practical constraints. So always ensure that the research you decide to pursue is feasible within the available resources, time, and ethical boundaries. Because of course, there are a number of research topics, especially in the biological field, where you're going to need ethical clearance. So again, these are things that you need to compensate for and make time for those things. And I can guarantee you ethical clearance takes quite a long time to happen. And often, if you don't get that clearance, you're unable to do the research until you've gotten that clearance. So you need to make leeway for these things as well. Right. So yes, I know my talk wasn't very long, but as a final note, so I'm going to just leave you all with my concluding remarks is ensure that you define your research topic, in this case, in the natural sciences. That requires you must, in order to define a project for yourself, there must be curiosity, right? And there must be critical thinking and attention to detail. So your curiosity is what drives your research at the end of the day. If you're not interested in the research and you're just pursuing it to pursue it, it kind of defeats the purpose. At some point, you're just going to get tired and you're not going to want to design new questions or try to answer new things. So the only way to make it fun is that you dive into a domain that you find fun. That will keep your research continuing. Right? And it begins with exploring broad topics of interest, narrowing it down, and then crafting specific research questions. By reviewing existing literature, understanding the context, and testing your hypotheses, you contribute to advancing knowledge in your field. And remember, the process is iterative, right? So you will do it once, you'll come and do it a second time around. But basically, every time you do it, you're trying to get it better and better as you go, right? So you're going to basically refine your research question, or you're going to adjust your hypothesis as you progress. And ultimately, the journey of discovery in science is as important as the result, right? So as I told you, sometimes you will find a research question you want to address, but you will do the experiments and it just doesn't work. It's science. It just happens, right? We don't always get the answers we want. But maybe you'll find something new and undiscovered in the process. So then the fun part comes in. So it is a scientific field. And as I say, nowadays with it being interdisciplinary, it makes it even more complicated. That now you have to take into account, like if you were interested in biology and the chemistry, you must now make sure that you take the bio into account. If you're doing the engineering side of things, then you have to make sure the engineering aspects are also considered. So the complication of research is getting higher, but there's still, which then means there's a lot more to discover, right? So yes, we've got lots of AI and all of this stuff doing things, but the machine is only as good as we train it to be. So if you as a researcher define something, the machine's not going to solve that problem for you unless you've trained it how to do so. So at the end of the day, that's just how it goes. So with that, I would like to thank you guys for listening. I know it wasn't a very long one, but I hope I've given you a little bit of insight at least.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for that presentation. Much appreciated. And it is a lot of information that you went over. I'm now going to be opening the floor to questions. So if you want to speak, you can just raise your hand and I will enable your mic. Or if you want to chat, if you want to type your question in the chat, I will um, alert Prof and we will address the question.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat now also, just to see.
Okay, so when you spoke about narrowing down you're basically, you start broad and then you narrow down specifically for your research. Will that then tie into your aims and objectives of a specific project?
Yes, basically, that is it. That remember maybe your broader, like in my case, my broader thing is to try and find an alternative to cancer treatment.
Mm.
But I'm not going to do that by just saying, okay, I'm going to take this big cancer cell lens and I'm going to just find a cure for it. I have to start small. So I have to see, okay, cancer builds up over a process. So I'll have to look at different pieces of the biological landscape. And each piece can be a project because, okay, if I can tackle this piece, will I find a possible solution? And then you go to the next piece and so on. But each one will basically then, that can be your aims and objectives for different projects that lead up to this ultimate goal.
Yes. And then I just wanted to ask, do you in your research group, do you align computational to experimental for every single aspect? Like, is there a computational validation for each experimental aspect that's out there?
We have validations for many experimental components that you would do computationally. Often, yes, you have to validate first. So you usually take something that's already out there that has experimental data, or alternatively, if you've got colleagues that are doing the experiments, you validate that your model works because you cannot make predictions with a model if it's not validated. So computers are good at predicting stuff, but they're also good at predicting rubbish. So if you don't prove that they're not predicting rubbish, often it's quite hard to get that accepted in a journal.
True. Okay, last question from me. Um, Going forward, how do you see computational analyses, specifically what you do? How does it play out within the research sort of discipline? Where do you see this field going?
Okay, the computational analysis in general, this is something that's booming everywhere now. I mean, you can generate large amounts of experimental data even. And if you write the right piece of code for it, it can analyze that data for you in like a second versus you first going to Excel and then putting it in Excel and trying to process the information there. Whereas if you can write one small piece of code, you can basically do it all for you. So this is the route that most things are going. And in my discipline, they generate lots and lots of data. So we can't even use something like Excel because it'll crash with the amount of data we use.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from anybody? Anybody wants to comment, or is anybody unsure and you need clarity on something? Okay. Clearly, your talk was very comprehensive and easy to understand, so I'm assuming that's why there's no questions.
I would hope so. Or people are very confused. I don't know which one.
Let's go with the first one. All right. Okay. If there aren't any questions, I just want to thank everybody. Oh, I see that we have a comment in the chat saying, "Thank you, Prof, for an insightful presentation."
You are
All
welcome.
right. If there aren't any other comments or questions or queries, I just want to thank everybody for your time. Thank you for availing yourselves. Prof. Governor, thank you so much for your time and effort and also supporting the RCD unit. We really do appreciate it. Um, don't forget to fill in the survey form that is in the chat. I will be sending this form via email as well. If you don't get it, if you don't get a chance to fill it now in the chat, you'll see it pop up in your email. And don't forget about the RCD-MS. If you have any challenges or inquiries, please email us at rcdinquiries@uj.ac.za. We are here to assist. Also want to say that you are not alone in your postgraduate journey. We are here to support and assist you through for every step of the way. All right. Wishing everybody a very good afternoon further, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.